Hey, I'm Marc Morgenstern. Welcome to my video series on the human side of buying and selling businesses. And it's all based on one of my maxims. People, not spreadsheets, are the epicenter of every deal. There have been lots of influences on my life. The 400 deals I've done is certainly part of them. Selling encyclopedias door to door was part of it. Following the Grateful Dead for 5 decades was part of it. It's also worth mentioning that I taught a course at UC Berkeley that I created called Street Smart Startups. It was all based on my book, The Soul of the Deal. It's really synthesizing all of those factors, the teaching, the writing, the encyclopedias, the deals. They all came to help create my flexible form of doing any deal by focusing on the people, by focusing on the deal circle. What does all of that mean? I try very hard to listen the way a musician listens, not the way a lawyer listens. Lawyers listen in the way they were trained. They were trained as advocates. And the goal of an advocate is to rebut or distinguish what you said, not to embrace it. I try very hard to look at the world through the lens of a startup, because that's different than a giant company. And I try even harder to pretend that I'm the owner, because owners think about everything differently than anyone who isn't an owner. Like everybody doing anything for the first time, I had many stumbles in my first dozens of deals. Part of those stumbles could have been avoided, and I hope to help you avoid them. What was my conclusion? I needed a much more systematic way to actually think about deals, to identify a critical path, to figure out which people were in that critical path, and which of them I had to persuade to say yes. It's also equally important to find out who could say no. And I wanted to find out who could say no as early as I could in any transaction. That translates to a deal circle. Who's in the deal circle? Well, the inner circle is obvious to you and anyone. If you're trying to buy somebody's company, there's a seller and there's a buyer. You are not likely to forget about them. Next to that is somebody you may not think about, which is their lawyer or their accountant. Those also are people who are involved in thinking through the deal and expressing their opinion and influencing the deal. We're going to call buyer, seller, lawyers, advisors. They're all visible stakeholders. They're obvious, you're going to see them. What's the opposite of that? Well, that's the people who are in the third and fourth circles of the deal circle. They're frequently invisible. They're not obvious to you. You don't see them. In the fourth circle are government agencies, EPA, taxes, IRS, SEC. You don't tend to think about them when you're sitting at a deal trying to negotiate something at a table. The next layer, the third circle, which I deliberately skipped over, is populated by many people who aren't at a negotiating table, but definitely have an impact. Employees, shareholders, directors, the media, PR. There are many, many people who will have a reaction while you're negotiating or after you're negotiating, and you need to think about them. So if you take circles 1, 2, 3, and 4, you have the entire deal circle, and that's the M&A map that you can use to intentionally and systematically explore what you need to explore, figure out where the pitfalls are, figure out which ones will be easy yeses, and they should be allies, which ones will be hard no's, and you'll have to blunt them or persuade them. That's the whole purpose of the deal circle. One of the things you can do if you're staring at the deal circle for every deal that you do as you're doing it, is you look at each circle and say, how does that translate? How will that person react? Will they be my advocate? Is this deal naturally in their self-interest? Great. That's going to be an easy yes. But when I'm looking at it, I may look at some people and think, they're not likely to be in favor of this deal. They're better off with the status quo. One of the numerous genuine stories in my book, I call it the splintered stone story, is a great example of how if I'd had the deal circle, and more to the point, if I'd actually used it correctly, I could have avoided massive problems. My failure to do that almost killed the deal before it started. Let me share with you how that happened and what lesson I learned. I was on the buy side. We had negotiated with a very competent, very sophisticated CEO. The entire time we thought he was the owner, he acted like the owner. He indicated that if he reached agreement, he had agreement, and it bound the company. We didn't actually ever ask him if that was true. It was so obvious in the way that he acted that we failed to ask it. fatal mistake number one. Always ask, always confirm. How did we find out that wasn't what was going on and rescue a deal that was about to die? While we were reviewing the corporate records, normal course for an M&A deal, part of your due diligence, we actually read the shareholders' minutes from the meeting in which they voted on the sale. We saw who voted, how they voted, and why they said they voted. We saw their stated reasons. But once we saw it, we sort of thought, well, we probably don't know their actual reasons. We just know what they said. 51% of the shareholders were in favor of it. Okay, that's great. They're my allies. 49% voted no. Okay, even I can figure out those are my enemies. Once I'd read that, I knew the what. What I didn't know was the why. Why were different people voting in different ways? And when you really examined who they were and their role in the company, it was pretty obvious. It was their own self-interest, not their view of the company, that determined their vote. The yeses were who do you expect? There were shareholders who were employees. They were early employees, early shareholders. They thought it was great. Why? Because they thought they were going to get higher pay, higher benefits, a bigger position at a bigger company, and they'd be getting cash. How could they not like that? The second group, which is also obvious, are the people who weren't employees. They were pure investors. Their only interest in the company was they'd purchase stock in it. They'd been in this deal for about a dozen years. After that long a passage of time, it wasn't clear to them that they were ever going to get their money back. Everybody seemed happy, nobody wanted to sell the company, and they'd never get paid unless the company was sold. So they were going to say yes to almost anything that was even semi-reasonable. It was in their self-interest. Who were the no's? And let me just take the biggest one and the most common one. It was the CFO. Was the CFO a bad person? Absolutely not. The CFO was actually a terrific person. But they did respond to their own self-interest. Do you know what happens after a transaction closes? What's the first thing that happens? When a big company buys a small company, the small company's CFO gets terminated or demoted immediately. The big company doesn't need two CFOs, and the CFO of the small company knows that. It's pretty obvious to them. So they voted no. What did they say was their reason? They said things that sounded plausible. It's too early to sell, the purchase price is too low, we've hung in this long, if we hang it a little longer, we'll all make much more money. But that wasn't any part of what was motivating them. When we read that, and by the way, you can almost assume that about CFOs, even if you don't look at how they voted, you know emotionally how they're feeling. At best, they're conflicted. At worst, they're hostile. Part of using the deal circle that's helpful is identifying those negatives as quickly as you can. And I should have already assumed that the CFO was going to be an enemy. I just didn't. How did we course correct now that we realized it? Pretty simple things. Right then, they were still an employee at will. We could have fired them the next day. To alleviate that, we gave them a 3-year employment contract. We increased their compensation. We gave them a fancy new title. They were going to be the chief financial manager. Now they were comfortable with their cash, their position, and the consequences of a deal to them. We got the yes. What are some reasonable takeaways from the story and my commentary? Here are 3 of them. Every deal is different. Every play has a different cast. You have to know who the players are. You can't try to use yesterday's tactics on today's deal. It doesn't work. Every deal is fact-specific and is human being intensive. You have to identify how these people think, why they think it, and how that aligns with you so you can reach full alignment. It shouldn't have surprised me, and it shouldn't surprise you. People's self-interest influences how they conduct themselves and what they choose to do. A subset of all of that is you should never assume anything. Get the facts and then confirm them. If we'd done that, we wouldn't have had a problem. Every deal negotiation has its own rhythm, its own words, its own vocabulary. As you reach agreement on certain points and don't reach agreement on other points, the leverage and the bargaining power between buyer and seller are constantly changing. At some moments, you think that the buyer wants it more than the seller. At some moments, you think the seller wants it more than the buyer. Whoever wants it less has a bargaining advantage. They have additional power. Whoever wants it more is weakened. We were weakened the second we realized it was a 51-49 vote. And so we did what you're supposed to do. We quickly changed tactics. We improvised. We figured out who we had to assuage, and then we assuaged them. If you've listened to all of this, and I'd like to say thank you for that, and you want to learn more, I'd encourage you to pick up a copy of The Soul of the Deal. Find a link in the description of this video.